It went slow in the beginning because we were both very busy with other projects and work, etc. But once we got rolling and we started interviewing people, we started getting these stories in, it was really exciting because we started to see that this book might be a lot bigger than we thought it could be because everyone had a story, whether it be a sports phone employee, a caller, someone like even Mark Cuban. I interviewed him because he invented a way to stream Indiana basketball games from Texas when he had moved back to Dallas. And his goal was just to be able to listen to the games, him and his friends. They were alums, and they wound up basically inventing streaming. I mean, it was broadcast.com. That was the first time anything streamed over the internet. And so even talk to him because like the technology as it progressed, it all kind of started at the sports phone level.
That was Scott Orgera, author of the book 9761313, How Sports Phone Launched Careers and Broke New Ground. Hello and welcome to episode 101 of the Irish Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Becker. John Fitzgerald is the founder of the Irish American Baseball Society, and he's going to be talking with Scott Orgera on the show today. This is actually the second part of their conversation. The first part aired in episode 99 on October 21st. Let's get back to the discussion right now. Take it away, John.
My name's John Fitzgerald. I'm the founder of the Irish American Baseball Society. And today we're welcoming Scott Orgera. He's an IABS member, and he's also the author of 9761313, How Sports Phone Launched Careers and Broke New Ground. And it's a really interesting book for anybody who remembers sports phone, which I vaguely do, but I actually have a memory of some of the things that came right after that. What's really interesting is the story of how the business came to be and all of the names and the very common, well-known names that came through and got their start with sports phone. So it's a really fascinating book from a lot of different angles. And as far as Scott goes, Scott is he's an accomplished writer and statistician. He's been working in sports for I think it was 3 decades, and he's worked Division I college sports. He's worked NHL, NBA, pretty much any sport that comes through the New York area. He's worked it, and I believe outside of the New York area.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
What was sports phone outside of the New York area? Were they in other cities, or was it primarily like a 212 area code?
So initially, they did everything out of New York, out of Midtown Manhattan, and they'd have lines in other cities, and you would record for those other cities from the New York booth. But for example, if you're in New Orleans, you might have a different rundown. If you're in New Jersey, you have a different rundown, and they started to branch out. But after a few years, it got so big that they actually opened additional offices. There was one in Chicago, there was one in Detroit, and they kind of mimicked what the New York office was doing. And it became so popular that there was a national line, a 900 line at one point as well. And yeah, so it all started in New York, but eventually you had something pretty much across the whole country, different regions where they'd get tailored content specifically for their area.
I mean, I may have missed this in the book, but I know WFAN was mentioned, throughout. But
Sure.
Was there like a direct connection, not to the personalities, but in terms of the concept of WFAN, which launched in '88, was it?
Yeah,
From one to the other, because obviously the 2020 sports flash and all of that mirrors it very closely. But was there someone at FAN that thought sports phone needed to be taken to the radio, or was it just coincidence?
it was not just coincidence. Now, FAN, obviously, they were doing a lot more than just scores, but the 2020 updates that you mentioned and just the rundown, the slate of games, etc., that a lot of that came from sports phone. And Ed Coleman, Ed's been in the game. Ed was in the game for a long time, and I interviewed him for the book, and he was at FAN in the beginning. And he said that early on, there were commercials that were targeted right at sports phone. I mean, even in the first hour. So Susan Waldman with the Yankees, obviously, she was also part of the book, and she was the first voice heard on FAN. And during her first broadcast, Eddie C was saying that they had a commercial going after sports phone, basically naming them. It was a direct attack. So FAN was trying to be a bunch of different things early on, but they definitely were trying to take some of that sports phone caller base away, because obviously on the radio it's free. And I think that they may have chopped off a small piece early on of the sports phone caller base, but advancements later on, like the bottom line ticker, on ESPN. I think that was a little more detrimental to the sports phone user base because that's constant. And you turn the TV on, and not everyone had cable back then, so people were still calling sports phone. But once you got cable, or if you were in a bar and the game's on ESPN, one of their networks, you just have to wait for your score to scroll across. So I think when that kind of stuff started to come about, people stopped using sports phone at least as much as they used to.
What was sports phone like when you started working in the 90s in ballparks, right? So and sports phone you said lasted till 2000. So what was it like at that late 90s stage? Were there still stringers like in the press boxes? How did
Not
receiving?
as much. So that started
Yeah.
to dwindle down, and there were other ways to get the scores, and sometimes they'd have people, especially at the New York area games, but it wasn't as intense as it was as far as coverage before because it didn't have to be. Um, Towards the end, they were at different locations. They had scaled back. They were in New Jersey and Franklin Lakes. At the end, it was run by Don LaGreca pretty much almost by himself. He had a few other people, but towards the end, it was just him in a garage. And the writing was on the wall that we probably don't need this anymore. And I think what happened, I think the way they were able to hang on, even after all these other inventions that we mentioned, is you had people that were just accustomed to calling sports phones, so they kept doing it. I mean, I still read the paper. I
Yeah.
still go buy the physical paper. There's no need. And you could just read the story online, but I just like print, especially when I love getting a byline and seeing it in print. There's something about that. So I think Sports One had a loyal user base that was still hanging in there. And Don and Gordon Damer and some of the folks that were there towards the tail end, they were doing other stuff too. They had hotlines directly related to the Rangers, to the Yankees, to the Mets, and you could call and hear specifics about your team. So that was still unique. That wasn't, done anywhere else yet at that time. So they had other things. They had a live line, Sports Phone Live, where, up to 30 people could be on the same line, like a chat line. And whoever the sports phone worker was on the other end would be watching a bunch of games in the office, and they'd give you whatever you wanted. You want play by play, they'll give you play by play. But it was chaos the way it was described to me because people would yell over each other. Like one guy would come on, he's asking for the Yankee game, and another guy comes in, he's like, I don't care about the Yankee game. Tell me about Notre Dame, whatever. And people you'd fight. And Gordon was one of those guys. Chris Carino is with the Nets now. These guys were mentioning it to me, and they said it was kind of like either being a lion tamer or an air traffic controller. You're trying to keep everything in line. People are yelling over each other. So they did have other things in addition to the standard line. I think that allowed them to stick around probably longer than you'd think their shelf life would have been.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. There's definitely like almost like a tech disruption type of angle to it. Just going back to when it started in '68 to what you just described, like a lot of like innovation on the fly type of things
Oh
where
yeah.
people just had to do it and they were able to do it. Can you talk a little bit about, I don't know, this may be unique to me, but like I just kept coming back to like the monetization of it. Like I guess just break down like how did sports phone make its money when the cost of the call, I just how did all of that break down? Because obviously it was a profitable business, but the economics of the whole thing just seemed totally, in today's world, just they don't make much sense.
So you mentioned 68. It wasn't even called sports phone then. It was just someone had an idea. It was a phone company employee at the time. Let's try to give scores and see what we could do. And it turned out that the infrastructure, the New York telephone at the time couldn't handle the amount of calls, and there was actually an outage for like half of Manhattan because of sports phone. Like, all right, back to the drawing board. They shut it down. 72, the hardware was upgraded. They came back. They could handle a ton of calls. Like, all right, now we can get this thing off the ground finally. But the monetary uh, side of it just didn't work because you had a minute. Sports phone calls were measured in minutes. So it was a 60-second rundown. You have these guys reading 30, 35 scores in 60 seconds, which was, we could talk about that after. That was like a completely new talent that these guys had to learn to be a part of it. But in 72, the way it worked is the phone company was keeping the lion's share of the money for each call. So the sports phone parent company, phone programs, they had to have advertisements on each rundown to make any money at all. and you only have 60 seconds. So if you're cutting 15 seconds into that with an ad, it's not working.
Yeah.
They tried that for a while. They weren't making enough money. Again, shut it down. They didn't give up. They continued to work with the phone company. They worked out a deal where everyone got a slice of the pie. Came back in 75 and it just took off running. As soon as it started, people just jumped right at it and the call volume spiked instantly. And at that time, for every call, every message unit, phone programs was getting a piece of the pie, and New York Telephone was getting a piece of the pie. So if you call, I mean, there were gamblers that did this a lot. And you mentioned the Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke stuff. I mean, we have court records from Jimmy Burke's trial in '81, the Boston College point shaving scandal, and these guys are calling sports phone back to back to back because they're gambling, and the biggest sports phone caller base were gamblers. So you have people calling upwards of 20 times a day. They're getting charged for each call. So this is why it became so profitable for both the phone company and sports phone, because people were just obsessed. They just continued to call. So we're talking tens of millions of calls a year, and that continued to grow exponentially as they branched out to other cities. And a lot of people got in a lot of trouble when the phone bill came. I mean, if you're still living home with your parents and you're calling sports phone a bunch of times, that phone bill was not cheap. So yeah, that's on the monetary side. It took them a while to get to where everybody, got their piece, but they got there in 75 and it kind of took off.
What was the cost per call? Was it just a dime followed and then a quarter?
It was a dime, then it became a quarter, and eventually it went up, obviously, over time. But you're talking astronomical numbers of calls. So they were making a lot of money. There was one of the producers there who used to work on some of the other lines as well, Joe Gauchi, and he was explaining the old technology. He said that there was a room in 919 3rd Avenue in the original sports phone office. There was a room where, all the phone lines, it was almost like something you'd see at a central office at a phone company, but they had this specific room in their headquarters at the time, and you could hear a click every time an incoming call was coming into sports phone. So he said you'd walk in that room, especially during peak time, or when there were rumors about Tom Seaver possibly getting traded, that kind of big stuff, the calls would just spike. Then you could walk in the room and these clicks almost made like a symphony. And he said you could hear how much money these people were making just by stepping in that room. It was pretty cool. I mean, today's technology, that sounds extremely archaic because it is, but back then that was sort of cutting edge at the time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I remember the trivia thing, which I think the sports trivia hotline must
Quickie
have been
quiz.
What was it called?
The quickie quiz.
No, not from the sports phone. It must have been right after sports. Well, no, around WFAN's inception, early 90s probably. Yeah, I remember racking up a couple $100 in phone bills because you could keep calling until you figured out what the questions were, and we won. And we won, I think, some tickets to some game that we couldn't even go to, but I wouldn't say it was worth it, but the experience was pretty cool.
And that's how we got Kenny Albert involved. Kenny was a kid.
Yeah, that's right.
So Kenny, and first of all, I just want to say this right now. I mean, the book came out 4 months ago, but I'm still it's still surreal that Kenny Albert participated and wrote the foreword, because I mean, to me, he's one of the best in the world, objectively speaking. And Kenny was a kid at the time, and he would call the Quickie Quiz, which was the daily trivia, and it was a big moneymaker, the Quickie Quiz. It became popular right away, and Kenny was this kid beating all the adults. He was winning all the time. And the cool thing about the Quickie Quiz is if you won, they'd read your name on the air the next day. And if you were, I think it was 3 winners. If you were number 1, they'd actually interview you. So here's this kid, and he said he'd run home from school. He'd be surrounded by media guides, which obviously, because of his dad, plenty of media guides in the house. And he was just soaked up sports knowledge as a kid. I mean, you could tell now how prepared he is for every, he covers every sport, which even during the Olympics, like water polo, and it sounded like he'd been doing it for 30 years. But yeah, so he'd have all these media guides around him, and he'd call every day, and he was always winning. So all the sports phone people that worked there, like, oh, sure, I remember Kenny. He used to win all the time. He'd beat out everyone. But the reason I even mentioned it, because you're talking about the trivia line, that just came about because they needed to fill some time during the day. I mean, this is back when the sports didn't overlap as much as they do now. So you'd have times like during baseball season where you might have nothing going on in the daytime, and they have people working there. They want people to call in, so they'd have this quickie quiz, and it kind of supplemented the income. But it became so much bigger than they thought it was, and that's the case with a lot of the sports phone things. They just created them on the fly, and some of them worked, and some of them didn't.
Wow. Huh. So as a writer, what was the process of you and Howie working together? I imagine a lot of the interviews were done remotely.
Yeah.
So from start to finish, like from concept to completion, like how long did it take, and how did you guys work together and get this done?
So we agreed to do it years ago. All these years working in sports, and I've been working with Howie for 30 years. Howie's a close friend, and he was a sports phone guy. Howie's a sports phone for a long time before he moved on. And I said I this was my idea for years. I kept hearing all these sports phone stories, different clubhouses, different press boxes, all these sports phone stories, and then looking at the list of people that work there is remarkable. And over the years, I'm like, there's got to be something here. I mean, there's been a few articles written, some good. Neil Best had a really good one in Newsday a few years back. I mean, nothing that took a deep dive though, because obviously you're writing an article, you're limited. So I always wondered why no one had written a book about this, because to me it was fascinating just on the surface level of looking at the list of people that work there, because like 90% of them went on to become household names in different industries or whatever. But I went to Howie years ago and I'm like, listen, I really want to do this. I put together an outline. I showed it to him. I said, no pressure. You don't want to do it because Howie's written a ton of books. It's a lot of work. Um, don't worry about it. I said, if you don't want to do it, you don't want to do it. But I said, I'm not going to do it without you. And that was the thing. I wouldn't have written this book if Howie didn't want to get involved. And so he agreed. He's like, hell yeah, let's do it. I've always wanted to. So it went slow in the beginning because we were both very busy with other projects and work, etc. But once we got rolling and we started interviewing people, we started getting these stories in, it was really exciting because we started to see that this book might be a lot bigger than we thought it could be, because everyone had a story, whether it be a sports phone employee, a caller, someone like even Mark Cuban. I interviewed him because he invented a way to stream Indiana basketball games from Texas when he had moved back to Dallas. And his goal was just to be able to listen to the games. Him and his friends, they were alums, and they wound up basically inventing streaming. I mean, it was broadcast.com. That was the first time anything streamed over the internet. And so even talk to him because like the technology as it progressed, it all kind of started at the sports phone level. So we did 107 interviews, and we did not plan to do more than 30 or 40. But as the stories continued to grow, we were like, oh, we have to follow this lead, follow this lead. So for a very long time, for the good part of a year, we were doing interviews. It felt like every day. And some were in person, like how we interviewed Howie Rose at City Field, like some we were able to do in person. A lot of them were remote, like video like we're doing now, audio, some were even email interviews. But the one thing that helped us move this along and get it to where it is now, everybody that we talked to, whether it was a sports phone alum, whether it was someone that just used to call, whether it was a gambler, even I talked to Ed McDonald for 2 hours. He's the prosecutor in Goodfellas. He was, the Henry Hill case. When you brought these days up, and it might be nostalgia, I don't know what it is. Everyone loved to talk about it. I'd say, oh, I need 10 minutes. Next thing you know, hour and a half, I'm talking to somebody. So we got all these great interviews, and it was a lot of work, but because there wasn't much out there, like I mentioned, so we had to do a lot of research, and the research wasn't really there. We had to dig really deep to get a lot of this information, but it was fun. It was fun because the people we were talking to were excited about it. Makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, I think that's what I think is so special about the book is that there's so many people who were involved and whose lives were impacted by this. But this isn't like the latest book on sports phone. Like it didn't exist. Like
Yeah.
there's nothing out there. And when you look at all the things that came out of it and during the same time, like I don't know, go back to the National or the advent or the rise of ESPN and WFAN, as we mentioned, and things like that. To my knowledge, there really wasn't much or any coverage of sports phone because they were a competitor.
Yeah.
So there's
No one talked about it.
yeah, that's it. Like this book is like, that's it. There's
Yeah.
no other account of it. And just an awesome job of just weaving the interviews in with the overall story, because everybody's got their own, you know, like way of coming at the story, how it affected them. But the big picture part, the narrative that you weave through the whole thing is fantastic, because it keeps everything on the train on the rails, and then you get to the next story and the next story. It just, you could really feel the excitement coming out of these interviews. And I know that's not easy to do. So yeah, what an awesome read.
Thank you for that. That it means a lot because just quickly, you mentioned that this is the only, other than the articles that are out there, this is really it's only book on sports phone. So one thing that I was very nervous about the entire time, even until, after the book had come out, and how he was on the same page with me, being a sports phone alum is a huge part of his life. Since no one had done this before, I wanted to make sure that we did the history justice. We didn't leave anything out. We didn't, just for the sake of getting the book out sooner, which we wanted to, we didn't skip over anything, because if we're going to do this, if this is going to be the record for sports phone, we want to make sure that we cover everything, good and bad, because otherwise someone else should be doing it. Because if you're going to write about something that hasn't really been done before, you better cover the entire thing the right way, because if you don't, I feel like it's disrespectful to the people that work there and the people that were a part of this. So I thank you for saying that, because I can never hear it enough, because again, even to this day, it's one of those things where the sports phone alums have given us unanimous praise for this. And that means more to me than anything else, because we wanted to make sure that we did right by them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've been in your shoes on projects like that, where, you know, it's so important to make sure you do justice to the story. But then for a guy like me reading this book who had nothing to do with sports phone, it is important to be able to take those stories and work them into the larger narrative, because if you can't do that, then you're just doing justice to some stories that nobody's gonna take an interest in. But man, this is what, how many pages is it?
What I don't have
500?
it in front of me. I think we're in the high 400s.
Four, yeah,
I
yeah,
know
you're
some of the pages aren't numbered, obviously, but listen,
eight.
when the book first came out and people started getting their copies, one of the comments was, before people read it, they're like, "Oh, this is pretty heavy." And
Yeah,
except that wasn't the plan. We didn't go into the saying we're going to go 200 pages, 300 pages, what at 500. We just
told the
wanted to
story.
make sure that we covered everything.
Right.
So you mentioned the Henry Hill thing, and I have to tell the story quickly if it's okay, because this is one of the, to me, long form writing is the best. Like you mentioned before, what you were doing with Backman and that team, you don't, I mean, anyone can watch the game and see what's going on, but if you dig in and get the stories about the people, to me, that's the best. So we're trying to find anything we can early on through old newspaper archives, etc. Basically, nothing was off the table. Anything that related remotely to sports film, let's see if we can use this. So I'm searching through newspapers.com archive for anything with 9761313, which was the phone number. And I come across this tiny article from a Brooklyn Court Dispatch, 1981, and it's talking about Jimmy Burke. And I'd known about that, obviously, from the BC scandal and Goodfellas. But I'm reading it, and it's just a court reporter's recount of what happened that day. There's nothing that interesting in there. But they mentioned that the prosecutor put a bunch of phone numbers into evidence, and there's sports phone. Just this exchange among other exchanges. It doesn't say it's sports phone. It doesn't say what it is. What the hell is sports phone doing in evidence for this case? And I'm like, all right, got to figure this out. I'm looking around for weeks. I can't find anything. Like, this doesn't make any sense. I'm calling the courthouses. I'm trying to get court records, all this other stuff. Eventually I did. But Ed McDonald, the prosecutor, I finally was able to get in touch with him, and he started putting the pieces together. And it turned out that, other than fixing games, these guys were degenerate gamblers, and they were calling sports phone all the time. So Howie and I were looking at these court records that I was able to get, and you see these guys calling each other during the BC scandal, during the conspiracy, and they're also calling sports phone a bunch. I said, well, we have to follow this lead. So I wound up tracking down the FBI agent that arrested Henry Hill. I talked to him for hours, and we wound up getting these really cool stories that tied into sports phone that had not been told before. I mean, we have stuff in the book that's not in Goodfellas. It's not in the 30 for 30 BC story. And I was like, wow, this is really cool that we get to tell. So I've always been a big Goodfellas fan. So we get to tell a little piece of that story that's never been told before. So that kind of stuff, as we went through our research and went down different paths, were just really cool because we didn't think it was going to take us to these places, and it did.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, yeah, the book is awesome. I highly recommend it. And Scott, I want to thank you for taking some time to talk about the book and
For having me.
yeah, it's a great read, and we appreciate you talking to us about it today.
Thanks a lot.
For John Fitzgerald, founder of the Irish American Baseball Society, and Scott Orgera, author of the book 9761313, How Sports Phone Launched Careers and Broke New Ground, I'm Rick Becker. I will be back on December 2nd with a new episode of the show. My guest will be Robert McLaughlin, who wrote the book Danny and Mickey, Ordinary Heroes. The book is about baseball legends Danny Murtaugh and Mickey Vernon. With the holidays on the horizon, I thought it would be a good idea to highlight books that may make for good stocking stuffers. Until then, this has been the Irish Baseball Podcast.